For context, I am a seasoned wilderness explorer. Since I was a kid, my passion has always been focused on nature. I've trekked through rugged terrain in many parts of the world. I know the wilderness like it's a close friend. I always research the wildlife in the area before heading out, so I know what to expect. That's what makes this experience so unsettling. One day, while browsing a travel site for a hike in West Virginia, I noticed an ad for a particular mountain trail. Again, nothing seemed unusual during my research, and it appeared to be the perfect hiking spot, leading to a stunning view of a bright blue lake. In my research, I found that the area was very remote, with the closest town being over 100 miles away. That made it even more appealing. The region had the usual plants and animals, nothing out of the ordinary. There was a note advising hikers not to disturb the wildlife and to be cautious of unstable ground that could give way, leading to a fall down the mountainside. Overall, it seemed like a typical mountain trail. I spent about a month getting ready for this trip. I made sure to tell everyone I knew where I was going, just in case something happened. Then I drove to the trailhead and began my hike. When I arrived, I marveled at the beauty around me. The start of the trail offered a view of many peaks looming above, and I thought to myself how the scene looked like massive beings standing over the earth. Then I began my hike. First, everything was normal. It was just another mountain trail. I made sure to take a break every 15 minutes or so to avoid exhausting myself. It was around my fifth break that things began to feel strange. The birds had stopped singing, and I couldn't hear any insects buzzing. Even the wind seemed to have stopped moving through the trees. It was as if everything had disappeared. After about 5 minutes, I resumed my hike. I was a bit on edge because I was the only sound in the forest. It felt wrong, as though something was watching me, some dark presence toying with me. I continued until I reached my 20th break. I stopped, took out my water bottle, and as I raised it to my lips, I noticed something wasn't right. I heard twigs snapping about 10 feet behind me. I dropped my water bottle and turned around to see what made the noise. I can't fully describe what I saw. It's hard to put into words. The creature was vaguely human-like, standing on 2 legs with pale, almost chalky skin. But its face was far from human. It had eyes that were far too large for its face. Its face, though small, seemed to be overwhelmed by its oversized eyes. The creature's mouth was beyond description, but the closest I can compare it to is a mix between a human and a dog's mouth, with rows of razor-sharp teeth. Its hands were unnaturally large, nearly the length of my arm, with long, thin fingers. As for the rest of its body, I can't clearly describe it. It was almost blurry, hard to focus on. That's all I remember about its lower half. I froze, staring at the creature. It hadn't noticed me yet, but I knew it wouldn't be long. Just then, I sneezed, and the creature noticed me. It turned its head towards me, but instead of attacking, it spoke. "Anigie," it said in a low, guttural tone. "I don't understand," I replied, shocked that it could speak. It looked at me, then leaned forward as if to say, "Go." I turned and ran, fleeing in terror. I made sure it wasn't following me, and I ran until I reached my car. I recently tried to find information about the creature, but I haven't come across anything. What I do know is that it spoke in Cherokee, told me to leave. After researching the area, I discovered that many people have gone missing there. I now think about the sadness in that creature's eyes, and I believe I know why it wanted me gone. I once camped out in a remote area near the border of Colorado and Utah. I was traveling across the country, sleeping in the back of my truck or in a teepee-style tent I had purchased online. One night, I set up my tent in a deserted camping spot, about 15 to 20 miles from the nearest highway. There was only one other vehicle in the area, and they were far enough away that it was quiet and peaceful. I fell asleep but woke up later to some strange noises on the tent. It sounded like something was being dragged along the nylon, as if someone was walking around the tent, lightly brushing against it. I stayed completely still, listening to the sound of something scraping the fabric without moving a muscle. After what felt like an eternity, maybe 10 minutes, the noises stopped. I continued lying there, listening for another 15 minutes or so, when suddenly my tent collapsed on top of me and my cot. A small support pole had bent, causing the tent to tilt at a 45-degree angle, but I was still able to reach the opening. I quickly unzipped the tent, dashed to my truck, climbed inside, locked the topper from within, and grabbed my gun. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, waiting for the sun to rise so I could go back to collect my tent, stove, and cot. At dawn, I returned to the campsite to see if I was just overly tired and imagining things, or if someone had actually been there in the middle of the night. In the dirt around my tent, there were footprints circling it. The prints were a different size than mine, and they looked like they were made by a pointed cowboy boot. The person had walked around my tent several times before wandering off into the valley. I've never returned to that spot and still get uneasy every time I go camping in a tent. This happened during one of my first solo backpacking trips in the springtime mountains of southern Nevada. I planned to hike up Mount Charleston over 2 days, spending the night, then reaching the peak and descending the following day. If you haven't been there, the trail is beautiful. It winds around the edge of a large valley before leading up to the summit ridge, offering stunning views. About 2 miles into the climb, a faster hiker passed me. Instead of just nodding and continuing on, he stopped and kept pace with me, and we started chatting. Nothing was particularly strange about the conversation, but there was something just a little off about him. He was too intense, too friendly. His charm felt almost manic. It reminded me of that interview with Tom Cruise where he talks about Scientology. This guy was like that, the same kind of forced friendliness. He was too much of a go-getter, too slick, almost as if he was pretending to have a real reaction. I remember him telling me that he really enjoyed pushing his limits, but was frustrated because nothing really felt challenging or exciting anymore. Nothing really got him going like it used to paraphrase. Well, this guy's vibe was really unsettling me, so I made an excuse to stop for lunch. The guy kept hiking, and I thought that was the end of it. I had an awesome rest of the day, and as I hiked, he slowly faded from my thoughts. I found a beautiful campsite on a ledge jutting out from the valley wall and settled in for the night. As night fell, as it happens to all of us when we're alone in the wilderness, I started getting seriously jittery. Full on nerves, man. My mind kept flashing back to how strange that guy was, and how he acted like something pretending to be a normal human. To make it worse, I was cowboy camping. Not even the flimsy protection of a tent between me and the possibility of encountering Mr. Smiley. So, to calm my anxious mind before going to bed, I placed my fixed-blade knife within easy reach, right next to my head. I eventually fell asleep after listening to a few episodes of Mike Duncan's The History of Rome podcast. I slept unusually well, not waking up once the entire night. When I woke up in the morning, I felt surprisingly content and well-rested. That is, until I went to grab my stove out of my pack. The location of my pack wasn't the issue. It was right where I had left it, leaning against a tree about 5 feet from my sleeping pad. No, what really freaked me out was that every single pocket was open. All the zippers were unzipped. All the snap closures were undone. The sleeping bag compartment was open. The interior mesh pockets were open. The buckle closures on my stuff sacks were unbuckled inside the bag. Nothing was missing, and the bag hadn't been moved. But literally every pocket was open. I freaked out, man. I had made sure they were all closed the night before. I'm meticulous with my gear. Someone had opened them. Panicking, I looked down at where my knife lay on the ground next to my sleeping pad. Sure enough, the snap closure that held it to its sheath had been undone. Let me tell you, I set a record for the fastest descent off that mountain. My wife and I were on our honeymoon in Shenandoah Valley National Park in Virginia back in 2022. We were eager to get a short hike in before the evening, as we had just arrived in the area. We were driving to a trail on Skyline Drive around 6 p.m. in a heavy fog under cloudy skies. We passed a strange-looking, lone man on the road a few hundred yards before the trailhead. I mentioned to my wife how odd he seemed, disheveled, blank expression, etc. We hiked about 1.5 miles up the mountain to where the trail met the Appalachian Trail. My wife stopped to pee, and we took a moment to rest before heading back down to our car. Out of the fog, this is true, came the guy we had passed earlier on the road. He was subtly holding one of those combo hatchet/hammer multi-tools at his side. He wasn't just carrying it, it was slightly raised. It gets even creepier. As we walked past him, he mentioned that he had found a set of teeth the last time he was up there. We awkwardly acknowledged what he said, nervous chuckle, and then quickly began heading back down to our vehicle, constantly glancing back to see if he was following us. Once we were about 100 feet away, we started running down the mountain. We would stop every so often to listen and check if he was behind us. It was terrifying. We fortunately made it back to our car, but we were shaken. A few weeks later, we read that someone had been arrested in connection with a murder near that area around the time we were there. We started our hike early, just as the sun was coming up. My stepsister and I wanted to get away for a while, away from all the everyday stress. We chose a trail that wasn't well known, one of those places not many people go. We liked the idea of it being just us and the woods. The first part of the hike was easy. The path was clear, and the trees provided plenty of shade. As the day went on, we talked less and just enjoyed the quiet of the forest. The trail began to climb up a steep hill, and we kept going, eager to reach the viewpoint we had read about online. As we got higher, the trees grew thicker, and the bushes became denser. The trail wasn't as clear anymore. It seemed like no one had walked this way in a long time, but we kept going, thinking we were almost at the top. My stepsister was in front of me, moving confidently through the bushes, but I started to feel uneasy. The air felt heavier, and there was this strange silence, like the forest was holding its breath. Then we came across something that made us stop. A big tree had fallen across the trail, its roots ripped from the ground, leaving a deep, dark hole where it had stood. The hole wasn't huge, but it was deep enough that we couldn't see the bottom clearly. Something about it made me feel uncomfortable, like it wasn't just a hole in the ground, but something more. We carefully stepped around it and kept moving. But now, every sound in the forest seemed louder, every shadow darker. We were far from any other people, and the trail was becoming harder to follow. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the path. We knew we needed to turn back soon, but my stepsister was determined to reach the viewpoint. Finally, we got to what we thought was the top, but there was no viewpoint, just more trees and rocks. We were lost. The trail we had been following was gone, swallowed up by the thick forest. I could feel panic rising in my chest, but I didn't want to show it. We decided to head back the way we came, trying to find the trail again. As we retraced our steps, we realized the forest looked different now. The fallen tree with the hole was nowhere to be found, and neither was the trail. We were surrounded by nothing but trees, and everything looked the same. My stepsister started walking faster, trying to find something familiar, But the more we walked, the more lost we became. The sun was setting quickly, and the light was fading. We kept moving, hoping to find the trail or some kind of landmark, but it felt like we were walking in circles. The air was getting colder, and the sounds of the forest grew louder, like the woods were closing in on us. Suddenly, my stepsister tripped over something and fell. When I helped her up, we saw what she had tripped over: a pile of rocks, carefully arranged in a circle. It wasn't something that would happen on its own. Someone had been here before us, but instead of feeling relieved, it felt like a warning. We didn't speak, just kept moving, more desperate now. The forest was darker than it should have been. The silence that had once felt calming now felt heavy, like the woods were watching us. We stumbled through the bushes, branches scratching at our arms and faces, until we finally saw something through the trees. A clearing. We broke through the trees and into the clearing, but what we saw made my blood run cold. In the middle of the clearing was that same hole, the one with the fallen tree, but there was no tree now, just the dark hole in the ground, and beside it, another pile of rocks, this one much larger. It didn't make sense. We had walked in the opposite direction, and yet here we were back at the same place. The realization hit us hard. We were trapped, going in circles, or maybe worse, being led back here by something we couldn't see. I looked at my stepsister, and for the first time, I saw the fear in her eyes that matched my own. We didn't have much daylight left, and we knew we couldn't stay here. But no matter which way we went, we kept ending up back at that hole, like the forest was playing tricks on us. We walked until we couldn't walk anymore, until the darkness was so thick we could barely see each other. Finally, we collapsed near the hole, too exhausted to keep moving. The night was silent, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, making it hard to breathe. In the pitch black, I could hear my stepsister's breathing, quick and shallow. The ground beneath us was cold and hard, and the woods felt alive, watching us, waiting. I knew we were truly lost, not just in the forest, but in something deeper, something we couldn't understand. And as I closed my eyes, trying to rest, the only thing I could think about was that dark, endless hole and what might be at the bottom of it. That night, we stayed there, if you could call it staying. We didn't sleep. We were too scared, too cold, too aware of everything around us. Every rustle in the bushes, every crack of a branch sent a shiver down my spine. But the hole was the worst. It was like it was calling to us, pulling us in with a force we couldn't resist. Morning came, but it brought no relief. The forest was still the same, the hole still there, and we were still trapped. The sun barely broke through the trees, casting weak light on the ground. We tried again to find the trail, to get out, but it was useless. The forest wouldn't let us go. By the time the sun started to set again, we were back at the hole, as if it had been waiting for us all along. And that's when we knew we weren't getting out. The forest wasn't just lost. It was alive, and it had chosen us. As darkness fell once more, I realized that we were just two more lost hikers, another story for those who dared to walk this path. And in that moment, staring into the blackness of the hole, I knew it wasn't just a place in the ground. It was a grave, waiting to swallow us whole, and no one would ever find us again. I'd been hiking the same trails near my house for a long time, so when my neighbor Paul suggested we try a new one farther out, I thought it would be a nice change. He said he'd heard about a path with great views, but it wasn't on any map. It sounded like a fun adventure, and I was up for it. We started early in the morning. At first, the trail was easy to follow, winding through thick woods. The air was cool, and everything seemed normal. After about an hour, the path started to get narrower, and the trees got closer together. The bushes were overgrown, and it was clear that not many people used this trail. Paul was ahead of me, walking like he knew where he was going, but I wasn't so sure. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, slowly disappeared, leaving only an eerie silence. We came across an old wooden sign, almost too faded to read, pointing deeper into the woods. Paul didn't think twice and kept going. I followed, though something didn't feel right. The trail got rougher, almost disappearing in some spots. We had to push through branches and step over fallen trees. It was tiring, and I started to lose track of time. After a while, Paul stopped and looked around. The trail was completely gone. There was nothing but trees in every direction. I looked back, but the way we came was just as overgrown, making it hard to figure out which way to go. Paul didn't seem worried and kept moving forward, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were lost. We kept walking, hoping to find any sign of the trail again. My legs were aching, and I started to feel dizzy from the effort. The trees were so thick now that the sunlight barely reached the ground. We hadn't seen a clearing or anything that looked familiar for hours. The forest seemed to go on forever. Eventually, Paul stopped again, this time with a confused look on his face. He mumbled something about going back, but the way back looked just as confusing. I knew we were in trouble. The uneasy feeling that had been building up all day turned into fear. We tried to retrace our steps, but everything looked the same. Endless trees and thick bushes. It felt like the forest was closing in on us. I could feel sweat on my back, even though the air was cool. We kept moving, but every direction felt wrong. I noticed Paul was moving slower now, his confidence gone. We were just wandering aimlessly. As the sun began to set, we found ourselves in a small open space. I didn't want to stop, but the darkness was coming fast, and without a trail, it was too dangerous to keep moving. Paul started gathering some branches to make a fire, but I could tell he was as scared as I was. We hadn't brought enough supplies for a night out here, just a few snacks and some water. The night in the forest was pitch black. The fire gave us some light, but it barely cut through the darkness surrounding us. I couldn't stop thinking about how we had no idea where we were or how we'd get out. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump, but it was just the wind or small animals. At least that's what I kept telling myself. We didn't sleep much that night. The fire went out sometime after midnight, and I was too afraid to close my eyes. The forest seemed different in the dark, more threatening, more alive. Every now and then, I thought I heard something moving in the distance, but it never came closer. By morning, we were exhausted, but we had to keep moving. The problem was we still didn't know which way to go. We wandered around for hours, hunger and thirst making it harder to think. The fear of never getting out started to creep into my mind. Paul wasn't saying much anymore, just staring straight ahead as we walked. Then, out of nowhere, we stumbled upon an old cabin, half hidden by the trees. It looked abandoned, with the roof caving in and the windows broken. It wasn't much, but it was something. We approached it carefully, hoping to find anything that could help us. A map, supplies, anything. The inside was worse than the outside, dusty with rotting wood, and a smell that made me feel sick. But on the table, I saw a stack of old maps. Most were too damaged to read, but one was in decent shape. It didn't show much, just some rough outlines of the area, but there was a path marked that led to a nearby road. It was our best shot. We left the cabin and followed the map as best as we could. It was still slow going, but the fear of being lost forever gave us the strength to keep moving. After what felt like another hour, we heard it, the sound of cars in the distance. I can't describe the relief that washed over me. We pushed through the last bit of bushes and stumbled onto a dirt road. We flagged down the first car we saw, a couple of locals who looked at us like we were crazy. They told us we were miles away from any trail and that we were lucky to have found that road at all. I couldn't agree more. As they drove us back to town, I kept thinking about how close we came to being lost out there for good. The forest wasn't just a place. It felt like it wanted to swallow us whole, to erase any trace that we had ever been there. I've hiked a lot of trails, but I'll never go back to that one. And I'll never forget how easy it is to get lost in a place that doesn't care if you ever find your way out. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the sounds of the forest in my head. The creaking trees, the rustling leaves, and that unnerving silence that seemed to stretch on forever. It's a reminder that not every path leads you back to safety. Some places don't want you to leave at all, and sometimes you don't. We were deep in the mountains, just a small group of us on a routine patrol. The ground was rough, but we'd handled worse before. We'd been out for days, pushing through thick forests, climbing steep hills, and crossing cold, fast-moving streams. The job was simple, just scouting, but every step felt heavier as we went on. The deeper we went into the wild, the thicker the trees got. The bushes grew tighter together, making it easy to get lost, even with a map and compass. We kept our direction, but the forest seemed to swallow up every sound, making everything feel closer, more intense. The quiet wasn't calming. It felt like the woods were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Late one afternoon, we found an old trail, almost hidden by the overgrown bushes. It wasn't on any of our maps, but it was a clear path, so we followed it. The trail twisted deeper into the forest, the trees crowding us from both sides. The air was still, and the only sound was the crunch of our boots on the dirt. After a few hours, the trail opened up into a small clearing. In the middle was an old, run-down cabin. It was out of place, far from any known paths or villages. The roof sagged, and the wood was dark and wet from years of rain and rot. It looked like no one had been there for a long time, maybe decades. We stopped, feeling uneasy, but there was no reason to avoid it. We decided to check it out, see if there was anything useful inside. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open. Inside, it was dark, with just a bit of light coming through the small, dirty windows. Dust covered everything, and the air smelled musty, like mold and old wood. There were a few broken pieces of furniture, an old stove, and some rusted tools scattered around. Nothing strange, nothing really worth noting. But as we moved through the cabin, a heavy feeling settled over us again. It wasn't exactly fear, more like a deep sense that something was wrong. One of us noticed a trapdoor in the floor, partly hidden by a rotting rug. We pulled it open, revealing a set of stairs leading down into darkness. We shined our lights into the basement. It was small, barely enough room to stand, and the walls were lined with shelves full of old, dusty jars. The floor was dirt, uneven and damp. As we looked around, the light caught something sticking out of the ground. A piece of old, frayed rope, half buried in the dirt. Curiosity got the better of us, and we started digging around it. The dirt was loose, and it didn't take long to uncover more. As we dug, we found what looked like old, rotted wooden boards, the remains of a rough box or crate. Inside were bones, human bones, scattered and broken, like someone had hurriedly buried a body and then forgotten about it. We got out of that basement fast, cold sweat running down my back. The sun was setting by the time we were outside, the light fading quickly. The air felt different, colder, like the forest was closing in on us. We decided to move out to get as far from that place as we could before dark. As we tried to retrace our steps, the forest seemed to change. The trail we had followed was harder to find. The landmarks we passed now looked unfamiliar. It felt like the forest was trying to confuse us, to keep us from finding our way out. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig, made my nerves jump. Night fell, and we were still moving, the beam of our flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. The trees seemed to press in closer, the path narrowing until it felt like we were being funneled into something. We pushed on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was following us. Finally, after what felt like hours, we broke through the trees and found ourselves back on familiar ground. We were out, but the unease stayed. None of us spoke as we made camp, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Couldn't sleep, not really. Every sound, every movement in the dark, made my heart race. The next morning, we packed up quickly, eager to leave the forest behind. But as we moved out, I glanced back at the tree line, half expecting to see something watching us from the shadows. The woods were still silent as ever, but that feeling, that something had been out there watching, waiting, stayed with me. We reported what we found, but it didn't seem to matter. The forest swallowed it all back up, like it had never been there in the first place. We left those mountains behind, but that feeling, that cold dread, followed me. It still does. Sometimes, late at night, I can still see that cabin in my mind, still smell the damp earth of the basement, still feel the weight of those eyes in the dark, watching, waiting for something. I know I'll never go back there, but it doesn't feel like it matters. That place, those woods, they're not done with me. It's like a part of me never really left. It's still out there, buried under the dirt, trapped in the dark, waiting to be found. And maybe one day it will be,